Today's webinar is called The Science of Compliance, Reformulating Products for Regulatory Success. I'm Mark Crowell, founder of CNX, and I'll be your moderator today. We've entered a new era where regulatory requirements don't just influence innovation, they define it. From changing ingredient restrictions to evolving global standards and consumer-driven labeling demands, reformulation driven by compliance requirements has become a regular part of doing business and staying competitive. Our panelists today have deep insight into the science, strategy, and real-world implications of these developments. Along the way, they've developed some opinions about how successful teams operate, what regulatory success looks like, and what regulators themselves should be paying attention to. So let's meet them. Denise Webster, VP of Food Safety Training and Consulting at SCS Global Services. Denise is a nationally recognized expert in food safety systems, regulatory audits, and process training with nearly 30 years of experience in manufacturing and quality leadership. Denise works day in and day out on the front lines with retailers and manufacturers. Gareth Armenius, Technical Director of Food and Beverage at Prescouter. Gareth works with global brands to identify and validate alternative ingredients and processes that meet technical, regulatory, and consumer needs. He brings a unique perspective to our discussion today, working at the intersection of marketing, life sciences, and regulatory requirements. And David Schronecker, President of Black Diamond Regulatory Consulting. With nearly 5 decades in the food and drug regulatory space, David is a go-to expert on global food additives, color additives, and pharmaceutical excipients. David brings a unique historical perspective to today's regulatory discussion, as he's been intimately involved in the regulatory framework for natural and artificial colors since the 1980s. Before we begin, I'd love to know who's in the audience today. Please take a moment to answer the poll about your role: regulatory, R&D, innovation, operations, or other. You can see the poll on your screen. We'll take a moment to allow you to make your selection. And then we'll jump right into the webinar. Philip, how do we look? You might be muted, Philip.
We have 60% of attendees are in R&D. We have 8% from marketing. We have 18% as executives and 6% from the legal side and 1 person from supply chain.
Excellent. Well, we've got a big R&D contingent today with us. And not surprisingly, we're going to talk a lot about reformulation and regulatory implications to R&D. All right, let's jump in. So let me get started with you, David. What are the most common regulatory or perception-driven triggers that lead brands to reformulate a product?
Yeah, that's a great question to start off with. And I think, the first thing, obviously, that triggers reformulation is when there's actually a regulatory ban or a regulatory reason that's forcing a change. So, for example, many of you are probably familiar with the fact that titanium dioxide was banned in Europe in foods some time ago. And of course, we recently have seen the FDA ban FD&C Red number 3 here in the United States. Now, it's important to mention, and I know we'll talk a little bit further about these types of issues as we go through the webinar, but neither of those circumstances actually were based on any scientifically credible data that actually would justify the need for a ban. In the titanium dioxide example, pretty much every other regulatory agency around the world, including the experts at JECFA, all assessed the data that EFSA looked at, and everybody came to a different conclusion and said that the European decision was flawed. And that's why we're not seeing any action taking place pretty much around the world from regulators on titanium dioxide. There's a few state things that people who don't misunderstand things are being brought up, and we'll talk more about that. With FD&C Red number 3, I'll mention also that the FDA, if you actually look at their notice, what they said about Red number 3 is that this was not based on any safety concerns they have for Red 3. It was based on a Delaney Clause issue. It's a very outdated regulation that exists that basically says any animal study, whether it's relevant or not, that shows any potential cancer issue, forces them to have to ban it. And that's what really happened. We don't have time to go into the details on this today with Red 3, but it's an interesting example of what triggers, when there's an actual ban, then obviously people have to react, and it gets back to your question of that triggers a reformulation effort. Sometimes, whether it's justified or not, you have to address it when it's a regulatory reason. Now, a key is, what are the target market countries that you're interested in, and whether or not those bans really affect what your customer base is and what your target market is that you're going after. The second big thing that triggers reformulation is what I'll call misinformation. And we're going to talk a lot about that throughout the webinar, because right now, today, there is a huge amount of misinformation being spread around by individuals, either on purpose for political purposes or because they simply don't understand the science. And you have a lot of influencers out there as well who are just trying to make a name for themselves. So misinformation many times will trigger people assessing whether or not they want to reformulate a product. And again, we'll talk more about when maybe you should think about that and when maybe you should ignore it. But misinformation is one of those key triggers. So I'll just come back to, again, the fact that you need to understand your target market and what's important to your customers. Don't just listen to what everybody is talking about. And the last thing I'll mention is one of the other triggers that happens is sometimes when this misinformation comes out, is you'll get marketing folks that sometimes are trying to basically, get a media splash. Look at us, look what we're doing. We're doing something here, even though maybe doing something is not the right move for your own company. Your own operations people might have a different opinion, but many times marketing people will sometimes make a decision that triggers reformulation or triggers company statements, when in fact that might be something you might want to think about before you go forward. And we'll talk more later on that.
Great 3 points, David. Appreciate it. So change in regulations, misinformation, and the whole blogosphere, and I guess you could throw politics into that as well. And then internal pressures from your own marketing operations can have an impact on what R&D folks are required to do to react. Well, Gareth, how do you keep clients or help clients anticipate that these changes in consumer sentiment and changes in the regulatory environment? How do you help them stay on top of that? You deal with a lot of large international brands.
Yeah, that's right, Mark. Typically, we'll run what we call an early warning system, where we're actively monitoring multiple inputs over time. And that sort of speaks to what Dave is bringing up with the multiple triggers. So we're monitoring multiple things, actively tracking proposals, agency updates from FDA, EFSA, and so on, state level bills. We're also watching out for things like advocacy groups, activists, petitions, and hearings, right? So those signals are often moving faster than the science or any changes in toxicology information or recent publications. More interestingly, nowadays, I think, is on the sentiment side. We're often scanning news, media, consumer forums, social media, all those channels, and really taking a look to see how are people talking about an ingredient, what alternatives are they maybe discussing in the same conversation, and what do they expect from those ingredients, and any potential trade-offs that they might accept. So what we've seen increasingly is single headlines or influencers can reshape the pressure that brands are feeling, even if the science hasn't changed, to Dave's earlier point as well about toxicology, right? So that's been a really interesting development that we've tied into our research. But I'd say really importantly, then we'll layer in and combine those inputs or those signals with expert input. So bring in people like Denise and Dave, right? And then we'll also couple that with academic scans to stay current on the science and assess if there's also a scientific sentiment shift at play as well. And I'd say the other thing that we'll layer in there as well are competitor moves, right? So are others reformulating early? Are they changing labels or preparing dual versions and formulations of products? And that can often tell us where the market might be leaning currently. So the goal with all of that is to a bit of being both prepared for likely bans, right? Because there can be a lot of projection and forecasting at play, but then also helping teams see the legal and regulatory tripwires, the scientific evidence, importantly, and the reputational risks before they're forced into more of a reactive reformulation.
So many different cross currents that have to be dealt with. Denise, what's the biggest compliance vulnerability you're seeing down at the plant level in the reformulation process?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Obviously spending years as food scientist helping commercialize products as well as making sure the food safety and quality at the ground level is effective. I've seen many issues, unfortunately. But historically, as an industry, when we make formulation changes, those are driven by, a CEO, a customer, and everybody wants it now, not and yesterday. So we have to act quick. But unfortunately don't have the adequate internal processes in place. Some issues that have occurred in the past are usually that poor communication between the key stakeholders, given their role and responsibility, whether it's food safety or the shelf life or packaging. And then we've had issues that you'll see in, the news around an allergen mislabeling or on a, new product or, food safety compliance risk related to other issues that the product isn't maybe maintaining its longevity. Could be quality related as well, and even audit nonconformances. So fast tracking reformulation, I would say, is the biggest vulnerability without having all those key stakeholders involved early on.
Thanks, Denise. Well, we've talked a little bit kind of around the panelists about strategy, what's driving product reformulation. I'm curious, what's keeping all of you up at night with respect to regulatory changes and reformulation? Philip, could we put a poll up and see if we can get some sense of what the issues are for our audience today? What the primary overriding sense is? And since about 60% of our panelists are actually involved day to day in R&D, I'm curious how that's going to impact the answers. What do we have? Wow, it's a horse race. So I guess number one, the answer is, how do you respond to evolving regulations? Closely monitoring, and that is a theme that our panelists have definitely put forward. Number two, already taking action. So taking that external and internal monitoring and turning it into plans and actions. And number three, preparing to take action. So various stages here among the panelists, but a lot of diversity and learning to need to learn more. Thank you, Philip. Well, let's get into section 2 of the webinar today regarding how do you manage risks and how do you gain these regulatory insights? David, how often do companies introduce new safety and quality risks in the reformulation process when they're trying to respond to these regulatory pressures for changes?
Yeah, this is actually a much bigger problem than a lot of people realize, and people will tend to have a quick reaction to something because again somebody in management said we want to do something or in marketing or whatever without realizing the implications it'll have, and so I guess the first recommendation I would say on this is everybody needs to be very cautious and not just have those knee-jerk reactions and because many times what sounds like a good solution on the surface to solve one problem will create what I call unknown unknowns. And those unknown unknowns can come back to bite you in many ways, many times. And you actually create a bigger problem than you had in the first place. Because again, remember, a lot of these things that are driving some of these reformulations are not really based on any scientific concern. And there really isn't any safety or hyperactivity concern when you look at the science. If there was, it'd be a different story, right? When there's truly a problem, we all would agree, we got to do whatever we got to do to change it or whatever. But when it's not really a problem, it's being driven by some of these other things. We really need to think through one, is it what we want to do? And then how to do it in a way that's going to minimize some of the problems that we have. So, an example of this, obviously, that's very current right now, and it's an area, as you mentioned earlier, I have a lot of experience in, and that is the area of synthetic and natural colors. Okay, and so there's this drive by FDA to voluntarily ask companies to remove synthetic colors from their products by the end of 2026. I must admit, I laughed when I heard that because that's such an unrealistic expectation when you understand the facts. There's a lot of misinformation around this where everybody's talking about, well, FDA is going to be banning these colors. Well, first off, FDA hasn't banned any of the primary synthetic colors, I would tell you from all my experience in this and many discussions I've had throughout the industry, I doubt that they're going to ban these colors at the FDA level. Okay. And the reason I say that is because, again, there is no scientific justification for taking an action like a ban. Okay. And if the FDA was to ban these colors based on the very controversial, science that's out there that people are using to say there's a problem, and many of these studies have been debunked over and over again. I suspect that the FDA would be sued in court, and I certainly would encourage companies to do that because I believe FDA would lose. That's my own opinion. Okay, I know there's others who feel the same way. There's not really a good solid leg to stand on to try to ban these colors. So again, there is no ban in place. The FDA, I think, is trying to use different tactics. Yeah, trying to push, companies to come to their own decision because they've changed consumer sentiment out there and use marketing, as a tool to try to push this. And again, it's not based on science, really. It's based on, people trying to get some attention to the MAHA program, and colors is something that gets a lot of visibility, and gets a lot of attention. So, the other thing I'll just mention is that, these unknown unknowns we talk about, right? So switching from synthetic colors to natural colors, a lot of people like to say, oh, that's a simple thing. You can just replace it with something else. Not true. Okay. Changing from synthetic colors to natural colors is a big deal. There are many technical challenges that, depending on the type of product that you're going to change, sometimes it's a bigger challenge than for others. Okay. There's many technical challenges related to trying to match or come close to colors that you've had with your existing products in the past. Many times that's not going to be achievable. Okay, you have major issues potentially with stability and shelf life. Many of these colors will not have anywhere as close to the shelf life that you're looking for. And many times that's not only due to light and heat stability, but also pH stability. So many times, the same natural color will have a completely different shade depending on the pH. It could be blue with one pH, red another pH, and purple at another pH. So how variable is your product from batch to batch can matter. So there's a lot more natural variation that goes on than what you're used to with synthetic colors as well. But then the last point I'll make here, and we'll probably come back to this a little bit as well, is one of the big unknowns that nobody's talking about, or very few people are talking about, is the supply chain limitations. Okay, and the reason I said earlier I kind of laughed when they talked about 2026 is that there is not enough natural color available in the world today to replace the volume of synthetic colors that's used just here in the US. And that is not going to change anytime soon because there's agricultural limitations, many other things that are going to limit the amount of color that's available. But that's something you really got to look at because those supply limitations are going to have a dramatic impact on costs as the demand increases and the supply does not. You're going to see even more bigger differences in cost between you currently have, and already many of your natural colors are 5 to 10 times more expensive than the synthetic colors are. So that's going to have an impact on food prices.
Wow. Wow. That is some interesting insight and perspective, David. And some of the numbers that you're putting out there are really eye-opening,
Yep.
and supply chain issues. And I was wondering how long it would take us to get to the term MAHA. So we were about 20 minutes in to the webinar before it came up. So I thought it would come up even sooner than that. But Denise, tell me, what compliance steps are most often overlooked when a product or claims or specs change?
Excellent question. When I look back, it's really looking first at what is the new ingredient and who is it coming from? Even if it's an existing supplier, we have to reassess the risk, whether it be its allergen matrix, the company's food safety plan. We also, just like David said, running true shelf life and sensory analysis support is key. Ultimately, that desire, as I mentioned earlier, for the speed to market can create unexpected issues. And even natural flavors, for example, can degrade over time. And then also one of the most common product claims that I see with reformulations, that desire to get protein in the product, and that missed protein element of calculating it based on PDCAS, which is a fancy acronym for how digestible it is in your body. And then you can just even state, I have 8 grams of protein on your label. You have to then calculate that DV. And so that is one of the things I see from a label perspective that's also most missed.
Well, we've talked quite a bit here about the difficulties and the risks of speeding up the reformulation process when there's some sort of a regulatory impetus, or there is a marketing impetus, or there is even an internal push for changes. I'm just curious, Gareth, how can R&D and regulatory collaborate more effectively to manage some of these risks and maybe even speed up the process?
Yeah, that's a tricky question, and some good points raised on this front already. It's challenging. It's not a simple task. One of the biggest things that I've seen work well is starting together. So really avoiding siloed teams. So if you can bring in your regulatory team early, very early, day 0, with R&D discussions, so that your ingredient choices are screened for all target markets from day 1. You understand, your potential largest hurdles, most challenging markets. The other thing actually as well would be looping in marketing early. And maybe this speaks a little bit to what Denise was talking about, so that your claims are matching both the technical feasibility and the regulatory limits, right? You also want to try and layer in the consumer insights to guide that development. Where I've seen that work well as well, or how I've seen that work well as well, would be when those teams are working from the same playbook and they're maintaining transparency across those 3 channels. So all the teams, R&D, regulatory, marketing, they should ideally work from the same reference materials and documentation. So if you can centralize that, make it available to everyone, agree upon spec and so on, that will make things more approachable, right? And agree on the strictest applicable standards early, right? That will help you avoid later reformulation when you're entering new markets or expanding. So things you can do along the way, coordinating your label and claims review in parallel with the formulation work to keep everything aligned as you go. And then jointly assess the substitutes that you're considering, right? So Dave brought up issues like the shelf life, processability, pH, water activity. There are all these things that go into it, as well as the actual food matrix that, or substrate matrix that you're going to be using these things in. And yeah, bring those into the conversation and quality before approval. The last thing I'd add in here as well is it's helpful to document the why. So if you're keeping a clear record of ingredient or process decisions as you're making them, that can help you respond to internal teams, customers, potentially regulators, and answer those internal questions along the way as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in for a minute, Mark, on sort of following up on some of the points that Denise and Gareth was making. One of the other sort of hidden unknown unknowns that has to be considered in the R&D process here, again, you have the desired outcome that you have. You have some of the limitations that are somewhat clear. And then one of the things that a lot of people don't look into enough is that when you change to an alternative, whether it be a color, a natural color, or some other ingredient that you're changing, it's not just the ingredient, the main component of the ingredient that you're changing, but you're changing the entire compositional profile. And again, I'll take natural colors as an example versus synthetics. If you look at a synthetic color, generally most of them are between 90 and 94% pure dye, and the rest of it is made up of other forms of the dye, very, very low impurities of anything else. They're one component primarily. You get into natural colors, depending on the color, they're coming from all different sources. They're usually made up of many different components, not just the main component, and that compositional profile and impurity profile many times will change from supplier to supplier, from season to season, even within the same supplier, and sometimes from field to field where you're getting these plants from, etc., or if it's a mined material from mine to mine. And so the variability that may exist there is great. And so what can happen is all those other components can actually start to have interactions with the other components in your matrix that Gareth was talking about. And so you may have this long history of using, say, red number 40 with this matrix and having absolutely no interactions that you of any concern. And now all of a sudden, you move to a natural color, and even though you've maybe come close on the color or whatever, in your stability testing, you've now got to start looking for all kinds of other components that might be forming that you never needed to look for before. Otherwise, you don't realize you have a problem until you get down the shelf life hurdle. And those other components that can form can sometimes have their own safety concerns, where the components that are being generated actually are safety problems. And so in trying to get away from something that's really not a safety problem, you might actually create a safety problem that you never dreamed of before. And that's something that has to be looked at very carefully when you move to these new ingredients.
What a great example of your unknown unknowns, sort of what we call knock-on effects,
Yep.
second order, third order effects. Coming back to your comments, David, I loved the idea here of working from the same playbook. I mean, I think we all talk about cross-functional teams, but here you really are pointing out regulatory, marketing, consumer insights, and of course, R&D coming together with sort of a set of actions that are broadly applicable to these sorts of regulatory changes. So, you're in the heat of battle, you've got a battle plan. I really love that idea of bringing together everybody under a playbook that everybody's sort of pre-agreed to. I think it's very powerful. So on that sort of topic, David, what misinformation around ingredients and labeling in your mind is most harmful? And how should companies respond to that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and there's a number of things about this particular point that drives me crazy, because so many of the things that are coming out there, or sometimes at the state level these days, are just crazy. concepts, and the one that drives me the most crazy is when they want to have statements saying, this material or this product contains materials that are banned in these list of countries, like we've
Mm,
said in the Texas law, for example. Okay. Well, if you look at the Texas law, there's 44 materials listed that they basically are implying are a problem in, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, UK,
mhm.
Canada. And in fact, many of the materials on that list, there is no issue with those materials in any one of those countries, much less are they banned. Okay. And one of the common things we hear all the time from the Maha group and from RFK and even Dr. McCary is, oh, these synthetic dyes are all banned in Europe. First off, not one of the synthetic dyes, including red number 3, is banned in Europe.
Really?
None of them are banned. Some of them have warning labels that were political decisions, not coming from EFSA, that were applied based on this Southampton study on hyperactivity that has been debunked for many
Mm,
years, even by the FDA. Okay. Um, and yet we hear everybody going, oh, they're banned in all these countries. I can tell you, I've done the analysis. None of the synthetic dyes are banned in any countries in the world except Libya and Nepal. And they were never actually banned in those countries. Nobody actually petitioned for them in those countries. Okay.
that's
And yet
that's
we hear, oh,
eye-opening.
these things are banned. Okay. Not true. So that drives me crazy when people want to have something like that on the label, like is happening in Texas and to some degree Louisiana, trying to force people to have that kind of labeling. Now, this is very interesting because of some very current information that just happened even last week. Okay. And what's relative to this whole labeling debacle is, there's been a case that was just settled last week in California on titanium dioxide from a Prop 65 perspective. You may have heard about this, right? But, titanium dioxide had been identified by some as a inhalation carcinogen, although the data it was never sound that justified that, but it got classified that way as a Prop 65 chemical. It was
Mhm.
challenged in court, and the first time the court came back and said, no, you can't require that labeling because there's no sound science that really supports it. Well, the state of California contested that and appealed that. And just last week, they lost again. And the court basically said, no, we reject your appeal. There is no strong science showing that there's really a problem with TiO2, and therefore it is no longer a Prop 65 carcinogen, and you can't force people. And what they used in this court case is really interesting, is they used the First Amendment as the basis for
Oh my
this
goodness.
situation. And what they basically said is you can't force companies to put something on their label that may not be true when in fact the science is not there to support it. And this is a very interesting approach that now has worked in this Prop 65 case with TiO2, but there was an earlier case earlier this year on acrylamide where also came to the same conclusion. The court said you cannot force manufacturers to make these statements about acrylamide when the science is controversial and not settled. Now, that concept is something that I suspect you're going to see a lot of other groups and organizations and companies, and I hope they do challenge some of these state laws like Texas. There is no strong science there, and yet they're going to force people to put these labels on. I suspect that could be a First Amendment court case down the road. And I think the same thing would happen if FDA tried to force a warning label. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this proceeds. But now we have these two precedences in California about strong science being needed. And there's a similar situation. I won't go into detail, but a similar situation happened with TiO2 in Europe as well, where the court basically rejected the classification of TiO2 because of the science not being strong. So I think this is something that we're going to need to pay attention to, and will have a lot to do with some of the misinformation and especially what goes on labels down the road. And with that, I'd like to maybe hand it off to Denise, because I think she might have a few comments about label issues as well.
Yeah, thanks, David. I mean, we spend quite a bit of time talking about the regulatory impact, but we haven't really talked about the underbelly of that, which is the social media influencers. Those that are out there now, they're getting even more bolder because they're going right to Congress. They're getting into those offices and they're trying to impact their initiatives. And now even with AI, we don't even know what's real anymore when we're going through our social media tags. The other day I was like, is this real? And I'm like, what's going on here? So the science, gets kind of watered down, with even just basic facts around certain ingredients and label claims. They're sensationalized, and essentially it drives those views and it drives the clicks. One recent issue that even, my husband's like, oh, no seed oils. We can't have any seed oils. It's notable that I know, right? John Hopkins just released a study in June that seed oils really have been impacted by this influence versus evidence. And the science actually supports a positive reason to still consume seed oils, and that it isn't our cause of inflammation or what's generally making us unhealthy. One, they noted that seed oils contain essential fatty acids such as linoleic that actually support cardiovascular and metabolic health. And so this demonizing of certain ingredients can shift the consumer mindset and have that misunderstanding of how things are made, how things are used in our body, and could actually result in trade-offs, such as consuming more higher saturated fat oils like coconut or palm oil.
A theme I'm hearing is it's not so science-based anymore. A lot of regulatory changes in the future may not be based on science. And I'm hearing, I think, an undertone of maybe a lot more things are going to wind up in a courtroom to be decided after laws that aren't based on science are challenged. And companies may have a lot of money on the table with some of these changes, especially the big ones. And they may fight. We may find a lot more court cases reversing regulatory changes. So I'm just curious, Gareth, how do you future-proof your products? How do you deal with upcoming regulatory trends that are reshaping the reformulation landscape?
Yeah, this is challenging. I mean, let's bring the science back into it would be the ideal scenario. That's not the reality, I guess, right? So actually, I'd echo a lot of what Dave and Denise said. Is what we're seeing really is that the catalyst for reformulation is shifting. So it isn't primarily scientific risk assessments. Today, we're seeing a lot of political pressure and consumer perception that can be more decisive than the toxicology. And I think we've seen that also with maybe some of the congressional hearings, I believe, also food influencers being, speakers on the topics. And I mean, a few key trends really come to mind, or a few key categories come to mind in terms of what we're going to likely see next. There are a lot of specific ingredients. Dave's been speaking about titanium dioxide and nanoparticle variants of that as well. But I mean, other things that I think we're going to keep on hearing more about are going to be the colorants, of course, right? We're going to see increased and continued pressure on the synthetic dyes, right? There's the state bans that we've been talking about. They're already in motion. There's more in discussion, New York as well, California, I believe. And that's maybe pushing brands towards these, what they're labeling or the language they're using around them are natural colors. Let's call them exempt colors, with big challenges around stability, supply, and cost, right? That's the other big one. The other, I'd say, key trend or category as well that I'm seeing are the sweeteners and ultra processed foods, right? There's a lot of discussion around that. So non-sugar sweeteners, those are facing closer scrutiny. And then at the same time, ultra processed foods and the definition of ultra processed foods, right? There's that request for information that's ongoing right now that's under review in the US and abroad. So I think those together, those are really going to influence labeling rules, and then also how consumers interpret ingredient lists. And maybe the last, I guess, macro category that we're keeping an eye on would be the sustainability aspect and novel tech, and what role does it play with all of these, individual ingredients. So the regulatory focus seems to be expanding to cover sourcing, packaging, environmental impact, right? And then you also have these new categories like cultivated or precision fermented ingredients, and those are raising questions about labeling, safety, and approval pathways as well. So, I mean, there are more, I'd say, specific ingredient examples, but those are, I'd say, the key categories that are top of mind for me.
We have a comment from it's not really a question, but the comment is from listeners. Natural claim lawsuit era, which I remember very well about 15 years ago, revealed that courts tend to avoid food science technicality decisions and ruled on matters of legal procedure. Any comments on that, Gareth?
I mean, I think the Delaney clause also might be the most recent example, or maybe parallel or comparison to draw on that front.
Great. Well, Denise, we've talked a lot about maybe how bigger companies might go to court to block some of the regulatory changes that they feel are not based on science. What about the smaller brands? What's one high impact move the smaller brands can make to kind of prepare in this new landscape of compliance difficulties and complexities?
Yeah, I think, when you speak about those small brands, that typically means they have a small team. And it's really important to have those kind of peers in the industry that have this knowledge, have a team that you can call upon, consultants, advisors, going through the, FDA kind of guidance documents or new issues at least once a quarter. There's a lot of different ways you can, be a small brand, but be a very highly functioning and not be caught off to some issue where, oh, I didn't know that we couldn't do that anymore. So awareness for sure. And then just like I was saying earlier, whether it's small or big brands, they should always have that cross-functional team of key stakeholders in their organization, and whether that's to get the buy-in up front or to make sure that someone's got their eye on the prize.
Good advice. Well, let's get into our last section of the webinar, which is, where does the science meet operations? And Denise, you are uniquely placed to speak about what does that effective cross-functional collaboration look like when you're in the middle of that compliance-driven reformulation push?
Yeah, and I'm gonna have to pull out my food safety hat for everybody on the call. I know a lot of R&D folks in the room. At the end of the day, we do need to conduct that hazard analysis to drive our food safety plans. We have to assess what that new or changing ingredient or formulation has from a biological, chemical, or physical. It could even trigger things like David mentioned, Prop 65 regulation. So what we really need to make sure is that we assess these things early on, put them in the timelines, especially for our projects that we do need to make a significant change. Also, the approval process for your labels. One of the biggest things we find is that rushing that label can create an unfortunate misstep, missing ingredients, nutritional panels. It says it's only got, it's got 5 grams of fiber, but actually the formulation, it only had 2. So it can be a wide variety, not just always food safety, but quality and consumer perception as well.
Well, Gareth, I mean, these changes are expensive, they're complex, they're full of risk. How do you guide product developers to anticipate regulatory longevity? You're putting all of this investment and risk into making changes, but how do you figure out how long regulation is going to be around?
Yeah, let me pull up my crystal ball, I guess. That's a tricky one to answer as well, right? I mean, the key is to try and build with that durability in mind, right? So I mean, first, likely identifying high risk ingredients as early as possible. See if you can track things like, are there current hazard classifications, petitions, policy discussions around them? And then maybe look at historical precedents as well, right? How quickly have similar ingredients been restricted in the past? And that might give a sense also of the velocity of potential change. The thing that I always try and keep in mind also is it can be helpful to apply root cause planning. If an ingredient's under fire for toxicology or sustainability or social media and consumer perception, choose substitutes then that likely won't face the same pressure or pressure test them against those same criteria, right? Um, the other thing also would be trying to favor multi-region compliance solutions up front. And I think I made the comment earlier talking about designing to your most challenging market from a regulatory and compliance perspective as well. And that can help upfront avoid reformulation if you're scaling globally. And then also in parallel, try and pre-qualify alternatives that might meet your performance requirements or come close, right? And how far out are those from a supply chain or technical perspective? Yeah, the last thing I'd mention there is, really layer in those non-regulatory drivers like the consumer sentiment and sustainability, because those are often, especially these days, moving faster than the science. Though one thing I saw this pop up in the chat as well was back to the natural labeling claims, right? Still the lack of FDA definition and still controversial. The other thing too is I mentioned exempt colors just as an example as well, right? I think the other thing is, what are people's perception of natural? If you see a naturally derived additive or color, and right, so that the other thing too, when we're talking about, is this going to be future proof against consumer perception and so on? Are these alternatives truly going to be perceived by your consumers as being natural? Is that derivation, purification, those steps and processing steps, are those in alignment with consumers' perception of natural? So yeah, definitely something to think about.
Well, let's get to our closing questions. Lightning round. Denise, what's the most impactful shift a team can make today to improve compliance during reformulation? And you may have touched on this already.
Well, you're right. We did share so many great ideas on how to be proactive. But one important reformulation change is to honestly consider the consumer. I see a lot of changes where a product or a company is developing a variant of their product, maybe be plant-based or vegan or some other claim or consumer diet variety, and they actually introducing potential new issues, such as this new bar has a cashew nut where none of their other products had it, and now we have an allergen cross contact potential. Changing nutritional levels, I've seen those as an issue as well. So really just considering the consumer, and how do you communicate those changes? So how do you get ahead of it? Not just put it on the market and hope for the best. There was a long time example where Campbell's Soup never told people how much salt or sodium they were taking out. They just slowly started to gradually remove it to adopt the consumer's palate, without saying, hey, we did this. So there's a lot of ways in order, one, to ensure compliance, but two, really focusing on your ultimate goal, which is that it's still something desired by the consumer.
Kind of goes back to, well, maybe you fold that into your playbook as you bring your teams together early, as Gareth was suggesting at about the midpoint in the webinar. So Gareth, how can smart compliance planning become a competitive advantage for brands? How do we turn this thing around?
Yeah, You're right, or that's right. It can be seen as a competitive edge or competitive advantage, right? So you could look at it from the perspective of building resilience, right? If you start every discussion with, if this ingredient were banned tomorrow, what's our backup plan? You can avoid emergency reformulation that's costly later, right? So that means pre-qualifying alternatives, making sure the supply chain is actually scalable, which avoids situations like carmine, for example, back to the food colorants, where sourcing limits can stall reformulation, right? The second thing is it enables consistency as well. So products and claims stay aligned across regions. You can launch globally without getting tripped up by more staggered reformulations. And lastly, I'd say, the marketing team will like this. It can create a narrative advantage when it comes to trust and transparency. If you can explain why an ingredient was chosen and show that you acted before mandates, that can strengthen trust. Finally, it protects your investment in R&D, right? So planning ahead aims to give your products a longer life cycle before the next round of compliance changes.
Great points. David, kind of bring us home here. What advice would you give to regulatory leaders juggling the science, marketing, consumer demands, misinformation? What do you tell them?
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot, and it's a difficult situation, and everybody has a unique circumstance, right? And I think, what I would say is, don't, going back to what I said at the very beginning, don't just react quickly to the latest misinformation or your marketing people coming in saying, "Oh my God, we have to do something." Think it through. Make sure you really understand what is your target market, because your target market may not care so much about some of these issues as somebody else's, right? So for example, if you're making a product and your main target market is, I want to sell to, the natural food, grocery stores that are into, well, obviously natural colors, natural everything is a big deal, right? But if you're selling a more general product into, the general population, do you really believe that your main customer base really cares, right? And although you may lose a small amount of market if you go one direction versus the other, is it really worth it, right? I still am under the belief is there is a certain very loud vocal part of the community who, hates synthetic colors and wants natural colors and all the rest of it. I believe the majority of people don't really worry much about synthetic colors. Most people out there are not sitting there making their decisions on what to get in the grocery store every time by looking at that label. There's a growing number of people that are concerned, okay? And you got to consider that in your marketing exercises, right? But again, if you just go in and start now bringing in a whole bunch of new problems and new expenses, and will your customer base be willing to pay more, right? Again, there's a certain portion of your market that don't care, and or that are, they'll pay more no matter what if they can have something they think is more natural. I mean, to Gareth's point, what they think is natural may not be the reality. There's a reason why FDA doesn't allow you to put the term natural color on your product. That's why they call them exempt, because there is no such thing as a natural color, except a tomato is red when you pull it from the vine. Okay, um, and many of the natural colors are extracted with organic solvents and everything else that people don't like to talk about, right? But again, what is your real customer base going to care about, and is it a big enough concern to take action today, or should you wait and do something a little bit later? Don't just react to the latest Maha news media blast with these press conferences that come out. And the last point I'll make is, I really like what I've just recently heard Mars has decided to do. Okay, because Mars very clearly came out recently, along with the National Confectioners Association, and said, we are not going to remove the synthetic colors from Skittles and everything else unless you ban them, FDA. And I think what they were doing was really challenging FDA to say, go ahead. Our lawyers are ready and waiting for that lawsuit, like we talked about, right? But what they've recently said is, we're going to offer a natural alternative, right? We're going to offer both, right? Give consumers choice, right?
Choice.
That's right. And then the consumers who really care about this can pay more and get what they want. And the other people who just want it a little cheaper and aren't worried about it get what they want as well. As long as there isn't a scientifically credible safety concern that really backs up the need to take something out, we shouldn't just be driving everybody to have to go down a pathway when it's not necessary. Give consumers the choice. I suggest more companies think about what Mars is doing. And again, General Mills did this back in 2015 when they said they were going to take the synthetic colors out of Trix. And they did. And it was these dull, nasty looking, Trix. And the market failed miserably. And by 2017, they said, maybe not so much. We're going to reintroduce the synthetic Trix and have both. And that way people can choose, right? That's a pretty good middle of the road solution. And I think more companies should think about offering choice and not just reacting to what Maha's latest issue is out there. Again, everybody's company is going to have their own unique marketing needs, and you have to think about that, but just don't jump. Think it through.
Well, Mars may have just given us all a new play in the playbook. Something to think about. I want to thank you, Denise, Garrett, David, an incredible discussion today. And if there's one message I hope we take away today, it's this: regulatory success isn't just about meeting a minimum standard. It's about making smarter decisions and supporting innovation, protecting the brand, and building consumer trust. And we've got some great pointers on how to do that today. At CNX, we work with companies every day to integrate regulatory strategy into the heart of product development so you can reformulate with confidence, launch with credibility, and scale without surprises. If you'd like to continue the conversation with us today or with any of our panelists, please reach out. We'd love to talk. And here is our contact information. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you again, panelists. We will see you soon at the next webinar next month. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.